H.R. 35, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, as amended. I seek to amend this legislation not because I take lynching lightly, but because I take it seriously. And this legislation does not. Lynching is a tool of terror that claimed the lives of nearly 5,000 Americans between 1881 and 1968. But this bill would cheapen the meaning of lynching by defining it so broadly as to include a minor bruise or abrasion. Our nation's history of racial terrorism demands more seriousness from us than that. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in his autobiography about the 1899 lynching of Sam Hose in Georgia. Du Bois wrote that after the lynching, Hose's knuckles were viewed on display at a store in Mitchell Street in Atlanta. His liver and heart were even presented to the governor of Georgia as a souvenir. Sickening, grotesque, the images of lynching. In 1931, Raymond Gunn was lynched in Maryville, Missouri. The spectacle drew a crowd of almost 4,000 people, including, if you can believe it, women and their children. In The Tragedy of Lynching, the author writes that one woman even held her little girl up so high so she could better see the victim, who was, quote, blazing on the roof. Sickening and grotesque, these images. In the summer of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was visiting family in Money, Mississippi when he went to a country store and bought some candy. While in there, he was accused of flirting with a white woman, and for that offense, Emmett Till was kidnapped in the middle of the night and bludgeoned so badly that afterwards his body was unrecognizable. He could only be identified by the ring he was wearing. After seeing her son's remains, his mother insisted on an open casket funeral so the whole world could see what the killers had done to her son. We must remember the murders of Emmett Till, Raymond Gunn, Sam Hose, and the thousands of others whose lives were destroyed by the barbarity of the lynch mob. But this bill will not do that. This bill would expand the meaning of lynching to include any bodily injury, including a cut, an abrasion, or a bruise, physical pain, illness, or any other injury to the body, no matter how temporary. Mr. President, words have meaning. It would be a disgrace for the Congress of the United States to declare that a bruise is lynching, that an abrasion is lynching, that any injury to the body, no matter how temporary, is on par with the atrocities done to people like Emmett Till, Raymond Gunn, and Sam Hose, who were killed for no reason but because they were black. To do that would demean their memory and cheapen the historic and horrific legacy of lynching in our country. As Congressman Amash stated, to be clear, the bill does not make lynching a new federal hate crime. Murdering someone on account of their race or conspiring to do so is now illegal under federal law. It's already a federal crime, and it's already a hate crime. He's right. We have had federal hate crime statutes for over 50 years, and it has been a federal hate crime to murder someone because of their race for over a decade. Additionally, murder is already a crime in 50 states. In fact, rather than consider a good-intentioned but symbolic bill, the Senate could immediately consider addressing qualified immunity and ending police militarization. We can and must do better. That is why no one in the Senate has been more involved in criminal justice reform than I have. No one has introduced more criminal justice reform bills. In my time in the Senate, I have authored or co-sponsored at least 22 unique criminal justice reform bills. I am acutely aware of the injustices perpetrated year in and year out in our cities. But reform needs to be more than window dressing. That is why I'm on the floor today to offer expedited passage. Pass it today, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill as amended. Lynching is a particularly vicious kind of murder, and a federal law should treat it as such. For these reasons, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act should be adopted with my amendment, which would apply the criminal penalties for lynching only and not for other crimes. Thank you, Mr. President.
Cruel and deliberate obstruction on a day of mourning. On this very day, at this very hour, there is a memorial service to honor the life of George Floyd, who was murdered on a sidewalk by a police officer with a knee on his neck. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, George Floyd pleaded for his life, called for his late mother, and said he could not breathe. The pain experienced not only by that man, that human being, and his family and his children, but the pain of the people of America, witnessing what we have witnessed since the founding of this country, which is that the Black lives have not been taken seriously as being fully human and deserving of dignity. And it should not require a maiming or torture in order for us to recognize a lynching when we see it, and recognize it by federal law and call it what it is, which is that it is a crime that should be punishable with accountability and consequence. Ahmaud Arbery was a victim of a modern-day lynching. He was murdered on February 23rd, 2020, just 3 months ago. Today we learned that someone heard one of the men who killed Mr. Arbery use a racial slur after shooting him. He should be alive today, and his killers should be brought to justice. No longer should the crime of lynching go unpunished. No longer should victims and their families go without justice.
This body did something historic. And I don't mean to be emotional, I'm raw this week. But I stood here with Kamala and we wept. And we talked about the hundreds of years, over a century, of effort to pass legislation, brought up and defeated time and time again in this body by avowed segregationists. And my colleague over there, Rand Paul, was one of the first hands I shook on this Senate floor. He is my friend. And everything he said about his commitment to criminal justice reform, it is right. I do not question the sincerity of his convictions. I've had too many conversations with him to question his heart. But I am so raw today, of all days that we're doing this. Of all days that we're doing this right now, having this discussion, when, God, if this bill passed today, what that would mean for America, that this body and that body have now finally agreed. Because I know when Congressman White, the last black person to serve in Congress before the fall, the god-awful fall of the backlash after Reconstruction fell, he gave this famous speech where he talked about the phoenix will rise, that one day black people will serve in this body. And here we are in the Senate making history, the first time 3 African Americans have even served together, Republican and Democrat, and we all came together leading on Kamala's bill. And that if we passed this, it would not only do something substantive to make a difference on the books of the American federal system, but God, it would speak volumes to the racial pain and the hurt of generations. I do not need my colleague, the senator from Kentucky, to tell me about one lynching in this country. I've stood in the museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and watched African American families weeping at the stories of pregnant women lynched in this country and their babies ripped out of them, while this body did nothing. And now one man, and I do not question his motives because I know his heart, one man is standing in the way of the law of the land changing because of a difference of interpretation. This doesn't talk about bruising someone. It's a difference of interpretation. Does America need a win today on racial justice? Does the anguished cries of people in the streets? I've had children break down with me this week, wondering if this would be a country that values their lives as much as white people's lives. I've had to explain to grown men this week that there's still hope in America, that we can make change in America, that we can grow and heal in America, that we can make this a more perfect union. Well, today is a day we can do it. One thing, one member, to yield for once, like he did in February of 2019, yield for one day and give America this win. Let us pass this piece of legislation today of all days. Let's give a headline tomorrow of something that will give hope to this country that we can get it right. It may not cure the ills that so many are protesting about, but God, it could be a sign of hope. So, Mr. President, I object to this amendment. I object on substance. I object on the law. And from my heart and spirit and every fiber of my being, I object for my ancestors.